At 34, Margaret Finch had $847 in her checking account, a 2003 Subaru with a grinding transmission, and a daughter who had just turned her out onto the street. She sat in her car in the parking lot of Hartwell and Associates for 18 minutes before starting the engine. The lawyer, a man named Thaddeus Hartwell, with a habit of pushing his glasses up with one finger every 7 seconds, had handed her a manila envelope and said, "The property transfer is complete. The house is hers. You have 7 days." Margaret had not cried in the office. She would not cry in the car either. She simply sat with her hands on the wheel, watching a woman in a yellow raincoat walk past with a coffee cup, living a morning that made sense. Then she drove out of the city toward a place she hadn't thought about in 22 years, a small town called Colton Mills, 3 hours north, where her mother had owned a tailor shop on Main Street. The deed was in her daughter's name now, 40 pages of falsified signatures. But when Margaret pried open the wooden panel beneath the front counter, her fingers trembling against the 3-4-inch oak, she found something her mother had spent 53 years quietly building, something her daughter had spent just as long making sure Margaret would never discover. The courtroom had the smell of floor wax and old paper. Margaret sat in a wooden chair that didn't roll, next to a woman from the county assessor's office who kept tapping a pen against a clipboard. Across from them sat her daughter, Diane, 28 years old, with Margaret's own face made harder. Diane's lawyer was young, aggressive, a man named Kenneth Press with teeth too white for sincerity. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, didn't look up from the file until everyone had been sitting in silence for 2 minutes. "Ms. Finch," the judge said. She was addressing Margaret. "You're contesting the transfer of property at 44 Sycamore Lane?" Margaret opened her mouth. Her voice came out smaller than she expected. "I am. That property was my mother's. My mother died in 1988. I inherited it then, or I thought I did." "You thought you did," the judge repeated. "I left it in my mother's name. I couldn't afford to." Margaret stopped. Diane's lawyer was already shaking his head, as if what Margaret said was not just wrong, but stupid. "I was 22. I didn't understand property law. My mother told me to leave it. She said it was safer that way." What Margaret didn't say, her mother had said it was safer because there was a man, once, who wanted things that didn't belong to him. There was a man named Earl Finch, Margaret's father, who had left when Margaret was 3 years old. And then when Margaret was 18, Earl came back. He wanted the house. He wanted money. He wanted to use the tailor shop as collateral for debts that weren't Margaret's. Her mother had sat her down at the kitchen table of that tailor shop and said, "Your name comes off this, sweetheart. Everything stays in mine. That's how we keep it safe." Now, 34 years later, that safety looked like theft. "Your mother passed away in 1988, Kenneth Press said, standing. He had papers in a folder. "Yet you never claimed ownership at that time. You never filed the inheritance with the probate court. No will was ever produced." Miss Diane Finch, as the sole surviving family member, filed a petition to assume control of the abandoned property 2 years ago. The petition was granted, and now, as is her right, Ms. Diane Finch has transferred the deed to herself, which she is absolutely entitled to do. Margaret's lawyer, a tired man named William Kowalski, who had cost her $2,400 she didn't have, stood up slowly. The property was never abandoned. Ms. Margaret Finch visited the property regularly. She maintained it. "Your Honor," Press interrupted, "Ms. Margaret Finch has not been a resident of the state for 14 years. She has no documentation of visits. She has no proof of maintenance. The property had been boarded up since 1999 and showed clear signs of abandonment." The judge took off her glasses. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Ms. Finch, do you have documentation? A property tax record, receipts?" Margaret had nothing. She had left town when she was 22. She had run toward a man, A different man, not Earl, and that man had run away from her. She had worked retail jobs in 3 cities. She had sent money back to her mother when she could, but she had been ashamed to visit. Ashamed of the choices she'd made, ashamed of who she'd become. Her mother had died in 1988, in that tailor shop, of a heart attack while hemming a pair of men's trousers. Margaret had come back for the funeral. She had sat in the back pew. Then she had left again. "No, Your Honor," Margaret said. The judge made a note. "Then I'm afraid the petition stands. The property was legally abandoned. The transfer is valid." It took 40 minutes for the judge to say officially what she had already decided. Margaret signed papers that her lawyer pointed to. She didn't read them. Diane looked at her once, just once, and Margaret saw something in her daughter's face that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. It was impossible to tell. Kowalski walked with her to the parking garage. His shoes were scuffed. His briefcase was held together with a rubber band. "I'm sorry," he said. "These cases are difficult. Family property disputes usually are. Can I appeal?" "You can. It'll cost another $5,000, and we'd likely lose again." "You need documentation, Margaret. Written proof of ownership. Unless you have something at the property. A document, a record." He trailed off. Margaret got in her car. She sat with the door open for a moment, one foot on the asphalt, the parking garage light gray and institutional overhead. Then she closed the door and started the engine. She drove north on Route 9, past strip malls and car dealerships, past a Wendy's with a broken sign, past a field where someone had painted a barn with an advertisement for a brand of chewing tobacco that hadn't existed for 30 years. The road opened up after 40 miles. Trees began again. The mountains in the distance got closer. By mile 180, the world had quieted. The highway had become a 2-lane county road. The county road became a state route. The state route became gravel. At mile 193, Margaret saw the sign for Colton Mills. Population, 1,847. The sign was green and white and hadn't been updated since 1994. She turned onto Main Street, and nothing had changed in her mind while everything had changed, in fact. The hardware store where her mother had bought thread was now a vape shop. The Five and Dime was a CrossFit gym. The bank where her mother had kept her savings was now an insurance office. But the tailor shop was still there, still standing. Still with the same green awning, though it had faded to the color of old money. The windows were boarded up with plywood. The door had a padlock. Someone had spray-painted something on the plywood in 2003 or 2004 and never painted over it. Margaret couldn't read what it said. She parked across the street and sat in her car and looked at the building her mother had owned. Her mother, Helen Macklin, had opened that shop in 1947, 3 years after her own mother died. She had taught herself to tailor from books, from apprenticing with a woman named Mrs. Cordova who worked in Hartwell Springs, from practice, from the small adjustments that neighborhoods required. By the time Margaret was born, Helen had a reputation. People drove 40 miles to have their clothes fitted by Helen Macklin. She had worked 6 days a week. She had worked every Sunday that Margaret could remember, at least until Margaret was old enough to understand that her mother was sad on Sundays, and work made it better. Margaret got out of the car and walked to the shop door. The padlock was from a hardware chain, probably 4 years old. The building behind it was brick, red brick, 2 stories, with a flat roof that somebody had tended at some point. She could see recent tar patches. The alley beside it was narrow and paved. A dumpster. Weeds growing around a downspout that had come loose from its bracket. She tried the padlock anyway. It didn't open. She walked around back. There was a window, ground level, with bars on it. Another window, 2nd story. The glass intact, but so dirty she couldn't see past her own reflection. The back door was the same as the front, padlocked, sealed. But when Margaret stepped back and looked at the frame, she saw something odd. There were hinges, 3 of them, and they were bright. They were oiled. They gleamed in the afternoon light like someone had tended them in the last month. She didn't go inside that evening. Instead, she drove to the one motel still operating in Colton Mills, a place called the Sunrise Motor Inn, and paid $49 for a room that smelled like bleach and regret. She ate a peanut butter sandwich from a convenience store and drank black instant coffee and sat on the bed fully clothed and looked at the television without turning it on. The room had a window that faced the street. She could not see the tailor shop from there, but she knew it was 2 blocks away. She knew it was standing in the dark. She knew those 3 hinges were gleaming. At 6 in the morning, she bought a crowbar and a pair of work gloves and a flashlight from the new hardware store, a Tractor Supply that had replaced the old one, and drove back to Main Street. The town was empty at 6 in the morning, except for a man in a Carhartt jacket opening a diner. She parked in a way that didn't face the street and walked to the back of the tailor shop and looked at those hinges again in the gray pre-dawn light. Then she put the crowbar against the doorframe and pushed. The wood was old, but it was held up by something newer. Deadbolts, heavy duty, the kind used in buildings people meant to protect. It took her 12 minutes. Her hands began to bleed inside the gloves. The crowbar slipped twice. The wood cracked and splintered. But then something gave way. The bottom hinge twisted. The door swung open. The smell came first. Dust, yes, but also oil, leather, something sweet, like old fabric and the ghost of pressed creases. Margaret stepped inside. The shop was exactly as she remembered it and completely unrecognizable. Bolts of cloth lined the walls, still wrapped in brown paper, decades old. Spools of thread, hundreds of them, filled wooden boxes that rose from floor to ceiling. A tailor's dummy stood in the corner, draped in a half-finished jacket, the basting stitches still in place, the shoulders padded with wool that had never been sewn into completion. Cardboard boxes labeled with names, some Margaret recognized, some she didn't, were stacked on shelves. Receipts, invoices, ledgers, cloth catalogs, pattern books, instruction manuals for sewing machines that no longer existed. Everything ordered, everything labeled, everything preserved. And on the counter, underneath the main work table, set into the solid oak of the shop itself, was a wooden panel. Margaret knew that panel. She had seen her mother touch it 100 times. She had asked about it once, when she was maybe 11, and her mother had said, "That's just old wood, baby. Keeps the front of the counter solid." Margaret had forgotten about it. She had forgotten about 1,000 things. She had spent 16 years running away, and then 18 years not coming back. Now she stood in the dust of the tailor shop and looked at the panel and understood that her mother had not forgotten. Her mother had been waiting. She used the crowbar on the panel. It was fitted with small brass hinges on one side and held by a brass catch on the other. When she pried at the catch, she heard a soft click. Not a break, but a release, as if the panel had been waiting to open, as if it had been designed to be opened by someone with enough time and enough need. Inside was a tin box, a leather journal, and a stack of letters, each one sealed, each one addressed in handwriting Margaret had not seen since she was 22 years old. She opened the first letter. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've come home. I've been waiting a long time for that. I hope you've been well. I hope you've been safe. I wanted to tell you this in person, but I'm a coward about certain things. I'm a coward about disappointing you, so I'm writing it instead. When you were born, your father wanted to use me. That's plain enough now, looking back. I was young then. I was foolish about men. I thought love was supposed to hurt. But the day you were born, something in me stopped being soft. I became a person who would take a crowbar to a man if he came near you. That's what mothers do. That's what I did. When Earl came back, I protected you. I kept the shop in my name. I kept everything in my name. I did that not to steal from you, but to keep you safe. But then I kept doing it, even after you were grown. And that was wrong. That was me being afraid instead of being honest. I was afraid you would see who I really was. I was afraid you would come back and find the shop closed, find me failed, find that all the work had come to nothing. So I hid things. I saved money. I kept records. I did it all in secret, the way a coward does. This box contains the truth. The ledgers in here show every penny I've made since 1947. The bonds in here are yours, 13 of them, $500 each, purchased on your birthday every year since you were born. The photographs show the people I've helped. The letters are the ones I couldn't send. The shop is yours. It was always yours. It always will be. Come home when you're ready. I love you. Mother Margaret sat on the floor of the tailor shop and held the letter in both hands and did not move for a very long time. The morning light came in through the boarded windows in thin gray lines. A truck passed on the street outside. A bird called, then stopped. Her hands, still bleeding slightly inside the gloves, began to shake. She set the letter down on her lap. She opened the tin box. Inside were the bonds, 13 of them, each one dated on a birthday Margaret had long forgotten she had. Each one with a handwritten note on the back in her mother's careful script. On her 5th birthday, for her college fund, if she wants to go. On her 10th, for her first apartment. On her 18th, for freedom if she needs it. The last bond was dated the year before her mother died. Margaret took off the gloves. She picked up the journal. The pages were filled with her mother's handwriting, columns of names, amounts, dates, alterations completed, money received, money saved, a life's work rendered in ink. She opened to a random page, June 1972. The page listed 17 jobs. Hemming a wedding dress, paid $35. Replacing a zipper, paid $8. Taking in a man's suit jacket, $25. Letting out a child's winter coat, $5. And then, at the bottom, in different ink, in a different hand, a note. Fixed free for Mrs. Patterson. Husband lost job. Will come back when times are better. Page after page was the same. Work recorded. Money tracked. And then, scattered throughout, notes of kindness, free alterations, extended payment plans, cloth donated, thread given away. Margaret closed the journal. She picked up the letter again. She read it twice more. Then she sat in the dust of the tailor shop. In the tailor shop her mother had built, and her mother had preserved, and her mother had hidden from her, and she finally understood that she had been loved in a way she had never allowed herself to feel. She stayed there until noon. Then she drove back to the motel and paid for another night and slept 12 hours without dreaming. Oh. The next morning, Margaret walked into town without a plan. The Sunrise Diner was open, the same diner she remembered from childhood, though the interior had been updated sometime in the last 2 decades. The booths were newer. The counter was laminate instead of chrome, but the coffee smell was identical. The bell above the door chimed the same way. A woman stood behind the counter, somewhere in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a braid, and forearms like someone who had worked her whole life. She looked up from refilling a coffee pot, and something in her face shifted. Recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it. "You're Helen's daughter," the woman said, not a question. Margaret sat at the counter. "I am. I'm Vera. I own this place now. Your mother used to come in here on Tuesday mornings. She'd sit right where you're sitting and order black coffee and a piece of pie. And she'd read the newspaper and leave a $5 tip on a $2 meal." Vera set down a mug without asking, poured coffee. I always wondered what happened to you. I left, Margaret said. I know. She didn't talk about it much, but she kept a picture. Vera gestured toward the wall behind the register. There, in a frame no fancier than any other diner photograph, was Margaret at 17, standing in front of the tailor shop, squinting into the sun. She had no memory of that photograph being taken. Margaret's throat tightened. She drank the coffee instead of answering. The shop's been locked up for a while, Vera said. She was refilling other cups now, moving down the counter with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Your mother left it to you? My daughter forged the deed. A lawyer in the city helped her. The judge ruled it was abandoned property. Vera stopped moving. She set the coffee pot down on the burner and turned back to Margaret. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, that's horseshit. It is. Your mother paid property taxes on that building for 41 years. There's no way it was abandoned. I didn't have documentation, Margaret said. I hadn't lived here. I hadn't visited. Not since my mother died. Vera wiped her hands on her apron. There's a man you should talk to. Name's Henry Cordova. He lives up on County Road 4, about 10 miles north. He was a contractor before he retired. He knows everything about every building in this town. He knew your mother, too. Well, how well? The kind of well where he shows up at the diner sometimes and orders coffee and doesn't drink it, just stares out the window for an hour. Vera set down a plate. On it was a slice of pie, cherry with a crust the color of butter. Eat, then go find Henry. Tell him Vera sent you. Tell him it's about Helen's place. Margaret didn't ask how Vera knew she hadn't eaten much. She ate the pie. It was good pie, made with real fruit, not the kind that came from a can. When she finished, she left a $10 bill under the mug. Bring it back when you're done, Vera said, pushing the money back across the counter. Done with what? Whatever you're about to do. Margaret found Henry Cordova's property by following the directions Vera had written on the back of a napkin. County Road 4 wound through forest, hemlock and birch, the understory thick with rhododendron. His house was set back from the road, a long ranch with a metal roof and a wraparound porch. Beside it was a workshop, a real one, not a shed but a full building with a proper foundation and large windows. Through the windows, Margaret could see the shape of a workbench, tools hung on pegboard, the organized geometry of a man who understood how to make things. She parked in the gravel drive. Before she could knock on the door, an old man came around the corner of the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with the kind of posture that didn't bend, the kind that comes from decades of standing at a proper workbench. His hair was completely white, his eyes were blue, and they looked at Margaret with immediate understanding, as if he had been expecting her. "You're Helen's daughter," he said. "Vera sent me." Of course she did. He tucked the rag into his back pocket. "Come on, I've got something to show you." He led her into the workshop. The walls were covered with photographs, old ones, printed on paper, mounted on boards. Margaret saw her mother in several of them. There was Helen, younger, standing in front of the tailor shop with her hand on the doorframe. There was Helen with a group of people Margaret didn't recognize, all of them in front of a different building. There was Helen, much older, sitting at a table with Henry Cordova, both of them looking at something off camera, both of them smiling. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," Henry said. He wasn't looking at the photographs, he was looking at Margaret. "She helped more people than anyone in this town knew about. I know because I was one of them." "What do you mean?" Henry walked to a shelf and pulled down a ledger, not the one Margaret's mother had kept, but something older. The spine cracked, the pages yellowed. "When I started my business in 1962, I didn't have much. Your mother altered my work clothes for free for 5 years. She never said she was doing it out of charity. She just said she liked the fabric I worked with, and she wanted to practice. But I knew. I knew what she was doing. He handed Margaret the ledger. It was a business record. Jobs completed, materials cost, labor, profit. But scattered throughout were notations. Cordova refit, no charge. Cordova, extend payment another month, no interest. Cordova emergency, 2 days labor, gift. She was keeping me alive, Henry said, without telling me she was keeping me alive. That's the kind of person your mother was. That's who you lost. Margaret held the ledger and couldn't speak. I've got a document, Henry continued. For you. Proof that the tailor shop was never abandoned. I did work on the building in 1994. Foundation repair. Your mother supervised every minute. I have the contract, the invoice, receipts for materials. I have a bank statement showing her property taxes paid in full through 1999. After that, I don't know what happened, but those records exist. They can be recovered. Why didn't you come forward when the deed was challenged? Henry looked out the workshop window toward the forest. I didn't know there was a challenge. I didn't know until Vera called me this morning. And I wasn't going to push myself into your family business unless you asked. But now you're asking, so I'm telling you, your mother's property is yours. And I can help you prove it. He gave her the documents, copies, carefully organized in a manila folder. He gave her the name of a lawyer in Hartwell Springs, a woman named Ruth Macklin, no relation, who knew property law and knew the county records office well enough to navigate them. And he gave her a key. For the workshop, he said, you need a place to work. While you figure things out, you come here. Bring your tools, bring your coffee, bring whatever you need. You don't ask permission. You just show up and work. Margaret took the key. It was old, brass, the kind that takes patience to open anything at all. One more thing, Henry said. Your mother left something else in the shop. Not the bonds, not the letters, something physical. I helped her hide it. I never told anyone, but it's there, behind the wall of the back room. There's a loose brick, about waist height, third from the left. Behind it is a compartment. Your mother was very careful about that compartment. Margaret drove back to the tailor shop and let herself in through the back door, which was still slightly open from that morning. The afternoon light had shifted. Everything looked different, more solid, more real, less like a ghost. She went to the back room. It was smaller than she remembered, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a cutting table and a pressing station, and shelves that held bolts of cloth. The brick wall was old, the mortar crumbling in places, patched in others with what looked like recent work. She counted from the left, found the third brick, and pressed against it. It moved. Behind the brick was a space, maybe 2 feet deep, carved into the wall itself, lined with something waterproof, plastic sheeting, carefully fitted. And in that space were more boxes. Margaret pulled them out carefully. There were 4 of them, each one labeled with a single word written in her mother's handwriting. The first box was labeled, "For Margaret." Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, organized in a chronological sequence that began with Margaret's birth and ended with a photograph taken of Margaret at her high school graduation. A photograph Margaret recognized, taken by the school photographer, distributed to all the parents. Her mother had kept it. Her mother had framed it, once probably in her own house. Behind the photographs were letters, dozens of them, written on different papers with different inks, all of them addressed to Margaret, all of them never sent. The earliest one was dated 3 days after Margaret's 18th birthday. The most recent was dated 6 months before her mother died. Margaret sat on the floor and opened the first letter. My dearest Margaret, today you turned 18. You don't know yet what that means. You think it means freedom. You think it means you can leave this small town and become someone important in a bigger place. You think your life is starting. But I know something you don't. I know that at 18 is also the age when you start to understand the choices your parents made, and you start to judge them for those choices. I'm writing this because I want you to know, before you judge me, that I was doing the best I could. Your father is a broken man. He was broken when I married him, and I thought my love could fix him. I was a fool. Love doesn't fix broken people. It just gives broken people a target. When he came back, when he wanted to hurt us, I did what I had to do. I'm not sorry about that. I would do it again. But what I am sorry about is that I'm not brave enough to tell you to your face. I'm hiding this letter in a box I'll hide in a wall, and I'm hoping someday you'll find it and understand that your mother wasn't as strong as you thought she was. Your mother was scared. Your mother made choices from fear. I hope you forgive me. I love you every day. Mother Margaret read through all the letters. They were arranged in order. They spanned 20 years. And they told a story she had never known. Not because her mother hadn't wanted to tell her, but because her mother had wanted to tell her so badly that she had to write it down and hide it, because the telling in person was too hard. The second letter explained how Margaret's father had threatened to take her, how Helen had hidden Margaret at a neighbor's house for a week, how Helen had worked extra hours to save enough money to hire a lawyer to establish custody, how Helen had been terrified every single day for 5 years that Earl would come back and take her daughter away. The third letter was written after Margaret had left town at 18. It said, "I understand why you had to go. I would have left too, but I miss you. I miss you so much that sometimes I can't breathe." The later letters documented Margaret's life through what Helen had gathered. A postcard from a friend mentioning that Margaret had moved to Baltimore. A chance encounter with someone who had seen Margaret in a grocery store in Philadelphia. The high school graduation photo, somehow obtained, treasured. The final letter was different. It was written in a hand that shook slightly, the ink sometimes wavering. "Margaret, I'm 73 years old. The doctor says my heart isn't what it used to be. He says I should be careful. He says I should slow down. But I don't know how to slow down. I don't know how to be anything other than a woman who works. So I'm writing this last letter because I think it might be the last one I write. I want you to know that I've loved you every single day of your life. Every single day. Even the days you didn't know I was loving you. Even the days I was too proud or too scared to say it out loud. I want you to know that the shop is yours. Everything in it is yours. The money is yours. The records are yours. The photographs of the people I've helped are yours. All of it is yours, and you can do with it whatever you want. Burn it. Sell it. Reopen it. Leave it. Whatever you need to do to be happy, that's what I'm giving you permission to do. But if you decide to reopen it, if you decide to do the work I did, then I want you to know this. The best part isn't the money. It's not even the finished product. It's the moment when someone comes to pick up their clothes and they see themselves transformed, and they realize that they matter enough for someone to spend hours making them look like who they really are. That moment, when they see themselves, that's why I did it. That's why I kept doing it. I hope you find that moment too. I loved you every single day. Mother Margaret set the letters down and sat in the tailor shop with the afternoon light moving across the floor. And she cried in a way she had not cried since she was a child. She cried because her mother was gone. She cried because she had missed her. She cried because she had come home too late. And then eventually the light changed. The afternoon became evening. Margaret gathered the letters and the photographs and the bonds. She locked up the shop. She drove back to the motel and sat on the bed and held the photograph of herself at 17, standing in front of the tailor shop, squinting into the sun. She slept with the last letter beside her on the pillow. If you've made it this far into Margaret's story, hit subscribe. because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 7 days after Margaret had found the compartment. It came through the mail slot of the Tailor shop, addressed to the current resident. Margaret was in the back room, cataloging the contents of the second and third boxes, the second labeled "For the Community," containing dozens of fabric samples and sewing patterns and instruction manuals. The third labeled "For Repairs," containing specialized tools and thread and documentation of the shop's infrastructure. When she heard it land on the front floor, the envelope was cream-colored, expensive stock, with her name printed in a professional font on the front. Inside was a letter from a man named David Stringer, representing Meridian Properties Development Corporation. The letter was polite. It was friendly. It was, in every technical sense, a threat. "Dear Miss Finch," it began, "Meridian Properties has become aware of the historical Tailor shop located at 247 Main Street in Colton Mills. We believe this property represents an exceptional opportunity for revitalization and community improvement. Our company specializes in transforming underutilized downtown spaces into vibrant mixed-use developments. We would like to discuss acquisition. We are prepared to offer $95,000 for the property, a price we believe is generous given its current condition. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss this opportunity." There was a phone number. There was a signature. There was, at the bottom, a handwritten note. "We are also aware of ongoing title disputes regarding this property. Our legal team can assist in resolving these matters." Margaret read the letter 3 times. She understood immediately that this was not a coincidence. David Stringer had timed this letter to arrive just as she was beginning to claim ownership of the shop. He was using the same threat her daughter's lawyer had used, the threat of a legal dispute, the implication that the title was weak, that ownership was uncertain, and that Meridian Properties could make the problem go away for $95,000. The shop was worth more than that. Margaret knew it without having to check anything. The building alone, the location, the brick construction, it was worth at least 3 times what Stringer was offering, and that was before you added the contents, the bolts of cloth, the tools, the equipment, the records of 60 years of skilled labor. But Margaret also knew, without having to check, that she didn't have the resources to fight this. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have documentation beyond what Henry had given her. And Diane would fight her. Diane had already proven she would forge documents and hire lawyers and do whatever it took to keep Margaret from having what was hers. She sat on the cutting table and stared at the letter and counted her money. $847. Plus the 13 bonds, now worth approximately $7,500 at current rates. Plus the shop, which was frozen in title dispute. She was trapped. That evening, Henry Cordova showed up at the shop without being asked. He had a key. Her mother must have given him one years ago. He came in through the back door and found Margaret sitting in the dark, surrounded by cloth. "Vera called me," he said. "Said you looked like someone had died." Margaret handed him the letter. Henry read it standing up. He didn't sit down. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "Don't sell," he said. "I might not have a choice. You always have a choice. It's just that one choice is harder than the other choice. That doesn't make it not a choice. I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't have documentation strong enough to win a title dispute. I have a daughter who's willing to lie in court and a developer who's offering me money to make the problem go away." Henry looked around the shop. In the dim light, the bolts of cloth looked like artifacts from a museum. The spools of thread were small galaxies. The framed photograph of Helen Macklin, which Margaret had found and mounted on the wall that morning, seemed to glow. "There's a woman you need to meet," Henry said. "Her name is Ruth Macklin. She's a lawyer. She's also the descendant of the woman your mother apprenticed under. She's the granddaughter of Mrs. Cordova. No relation to me, just the same last name." Ruth owes your mother a debt that's been sitting on her conscience for 30 years. I'm going to call her, and you're not going to say no." He pulled out his phone, a flip phone, old, the kind people still used in small towns where cell reception was intermittent, and dialed without waiting for Margaret to respond. The conversation was short. "It's Henry. I need you to take a case. Yes, I know it's late. Yes, I know you're retired. No, I don't care. This is the one that matters." He hung up and looked at Margaret. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, her office in Hartwell Springs. You bring the documents I gave you, and you bring those bonds, and you bring your mother's ledgers, and you bring the letter from David Stringer. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded. "Good," Henry said. "Now lock up this place. I'm going to follow you back to the motel and make sure you eat something, because you look like you haven't eaten in 2 days." "I had coffee." "Coffee isn't food." Henry was right. Margaret locked up the shop and followed him to the motel, and he sat in the diner booth next to her while she ate a cheeseburger she didn't want. He didn't talk. He just sat and drank black coffee and kept her company in the way people do when they understand that some kinds of help don't require words. When she finished, he stood. He put a hand on her shoulder, the first time he had touched her, and he said, "Your mother was the strongest woman I've ever known. You're her daughter. You're going to be okay." Then he left her there, and Margaret sat in the booth and watched Vera move around the diner, refilling coffee cups, checking on other customers, living the quiet life of a woman who had made a business out of small kindnesses. She understood then what her mother had been teaching her all along, in a language she had been too young and too angry to speak. Ruth Macklin's office was on the second floor of a brick building that had once been a bank. The stairs were wooden, the handrail smooth from decades of hands. At the top was a single door with frosted glass and Ruth's name painted in gold leaf. Margaret knocked at 10 o'clock exactly. Ruth answered immediately, as if she had been waiting by the door. She was in her late 60s, with short gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested she had spent her life reading at a desk. She wore glasses on a beaded chain. She wore a cardigan buttoned only at the middle buttons, the way people do when they dress for comfort rather than appearance. "You look like your mother," Ruth said before Margaret could speak. "Around the eyes. Come in." The office was small, lined with books, with a window that faced the street below. There was a desk, a comfortable chair, and a sofa that had been reupholstered at least once. Ruth gestured to the sofa and sat in the desk chair, turning it to face Margaret directly. "Henry told me what happened," Ruth said. "Tell me the rest." Margaret laid out the documents, the property tax records Henry had given her, the building inspection from 1994, the business ledgers her mother had kept, the letter from Meridian Properties, the court decision that had transferred the deed to Diane. Ruth read everything slowly. She made notes. She cross-referenced documents. She spent 45 minutes in complete silence, moving through the papers with the precision of someone trained to see what other people missed. Finally, she set down her pen. "The deed transfer is vulnerable," she said. "Your mother paid property taxes continuously through 1999. That's not abandonment, that's active ownership. After 1999, the county records show the taxes were paid by a property management company. I need to find out who hired them, but I suspect it was your mother." "She died in 1988, Margaret said. 31 years before 1999. "Exactly," Ruth said, "which means someone else was paying the taxes on her behalf. Someone who was following her instructions. Someone who wanted the property to remain secure until you came back to claim it." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. "My mother couldn't have arranged that. She was already dead." "No," Ruth agreed, "but she could have arranged it in her will. Instructed an executor or a trustee to maintain the property indefinitely. It's unusual, but it's legal. We need to find her will." "I don't have a will." Then we need to find the probate filing from 1988. There's always a will filed with probate, even if the deceased left everything to a single heir. Let me make some calls. Ruth picked up her phone, a modern phone connected to the modern world, and called the county courthouse. She spoke to a clerk who apparently knew her. She asked about probate filings from 1988. She provided names and dates. Then she waited, pen in hand, while someone on the other end of the line searched through decades-old records. When the clerk came back on the line, Ruth's expression changed. She sat up straighter. She started writing rapidly. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I understand. And the executor? The executor is still listed as... I see. How long has that been? 40 years? And there's never been a final accounting filed? All right. Thank you. I'll be in touch." She hung up and looked at Margaret. "Your mother left a will," Ruth said. "It was filed in probate court in 1988. The property was left to you as expected. But she also appointed an executor and a trustee to manage the property and ensure it was maintained until you came of age and claimed it. The trustee's responsibility was to keep the building in good repair and ensure the taxes were paid." "Who was the trustee?" "A woman named Eleanor Walsh. She lived in Colton Mills. According to the courthouse record, she was your mother's closest friend." Margaret tried to remember an Eleanor Walsh. The name meant nothing to her. "Is she still alive?" "The courthouse doesn't know. The last update to the probate file was in 1999, when Eleanor reported that the property maintenance was complete and the building was secure. After that, there's nothing. No final accounting, no notice of the executor's death. Nothing." Ruth stood and walked to a filing cabinet. She pulled out a phone directory, an actual physical phone directory, yellowed with age. She opened it to the W's and ran her finger down the page. "Eleanor Walsh," she said, or was. "The listing is from 1998. The address is 312 Birch Street, Colton Mills. No phone number listed, but the address might still be valid." Margaret drove back to Colton Mills alone. She found Birch Street without difficulty. It was parallel to Main Street, 1 block north. A quiet street with old houses set back from the road, separated by large yards. Number 312 was a small cottage, white with green shutters, a stone chimney, a porch with a swing. The yard was tended, though not obsessively. The grass was cut, but the flower beds were empty. There was a blue mailbox at the end of the driveway. Margaret parked and sat for a moment, gathering the nerve to knock on a stranger's door. But as she was getting out of the car, the front door opened. An old woman stepped out onto the porch. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with white hair and the kind of face that showed its age without apology. She wore a cardigan, even though it was warm. She held a coffee mug. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. "Are you Eleanor Walsh?" "I am. My name is Margaret Finch. I'm Helen Macklin's daughter." The coffee mug slipped from Eleanor's hand and shattered on the porch. For a moment, Eleanor didn't move. Then she sat down on the porch swing, as if her legs had stopped working. "Helen's daughter," she said. "You knew my mother." "I did. I knew her very well. I loved her, and I've been waiting 40 years for you to come home." Margaret climbed the porch steps and sat next to Eleanor on the swing. Eleanor reached out and took Margaret's hand. Her skin was paper thin, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your mother was the best person I ever knew," Eleanor said, "and she asked me before she died to take care of the shop, to keep it safe, to wait for you." "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Why didn't you come find me?" "Because your mother said you needed to find yourself first. She said you needed to live your own life and make your own choices, without the weight of her expectations. She said you'd come back when you were ready. And she was right. You came back." Eleanor held Margaret's hand while Margaret cried, and then Eleanor told her the story of her friendship with Helen Macklin, beginning in 1945, when they were both young women learning to sew, and ending in 1988, when Helen had pressed a key into Eleanor's hand and said, "The shop is hers. Keep it for her. Tell her I loved her." Eleanor had kept the shop. Eleanor had paid the taxes through a property management company, using the money Helen had left in trust. Eleanor had made sure the building was maintained, the hinges oiled, the foundation repaired. Eleanor had kept the promise she had made to a friend who had changed her life, and for 40 years Eleanor had lived on that quiet street, waiting to meet the woman her friend's daughter would become. Margaret stayed on that porch until the sun began to set. She listened to Eleanor talk about her mother. She learned about the Tailor shop's history, how Helen had taught Eleanor to sew, how Eleanor had opened a small alterations business for 10 years before closing it to care for her ailing mother, how Helen had helped her through that, never asking for anything in return. She learned that her mother had been more than a businesswoman. She had been a friend, a confidant, a woman who understood that the best way to love someone was to show up and help, without needing credit or recognition. By the time the sun touched the horizon, Margaret understood that her mother's legacy was not the shop alone. It was not the bonds or the money or the ledgers. It was the people her mother had helped. It was Eleanor still living in this quiet house, still remembering. It was Vera, who had kept Margaret's photo on the diner wall. It was Henry, who had hidden the compartment with careful hands. It was all of them, a network of quiet kindness spreading out like roots from the Tailor shop, holding the town together. "I need to fight for the shop," Margaret said to Eleanor as the light faded. "My daughter forged a deed. A developer is trying to buy it. I need to prove it's mine." Eleanor nodded. "Then you fight. And when you do, you won't be fighting alone. Your mother made sure of that." The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in the county courthouse in Hartwell Springs. Ruth Macklin spent those 3 weeks building a case. She filed a motion to reopen the original probate proceeding based on evidence that the property had never been abandoned. She submitted the property tax records, the building inspection from 1994, Eleanor's testimony about the trust arrangement. She requested a full accounting of the probate estate, demanding to see all documents related to the trustee's management of the property. The response came back 2 weeks before the hearing. The original will had been filed correctly. The property had been left to Margaret Finch. The trustee, Eleanor Walsh, had been authorized to maintain the property indefinitely pending Margaret's claim. The final accounting, filed in 1999, showed that all taxes had been paid, all maintenance completed, and the property was ready to be claimed by the heir. The deed transfer to Diane Finch had been done without proper notice to the legitimate owner. It was, Ruth wrote in her brief, a fraudulent transfer based on a misrepresentation of abandonment perpetrated in violation of the heir's property rights. Margaret's daughter hired a lawyer, a woman named Susan Helms, who worked for the same firm that had done the original fraudulent transfer. Helms filed a response claiming that Margaret had abandoned the property for 31 years, that there was no documentary evidence of Margaret's interest in the property, that the property was therefore available to be claimed by the next of kin. The night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in the tailor shop at 2 in the morning, surrounded by bolts of cloth, by spools of thread, by all the evidence of her mother's life, and she counted the ways she could lose. She could lose because Diane had more money. She could lose because the courts favored clear title over historical ownership. She could lose because she had been gone too long, and the law had decided that absence was abandonment. She was sitting at her mother's old work table, staring at nothing when Henry arrived. He must have seen her car. He came through the back door without knocking and set down 2 cups of coffee. "You need to sleep," he said. "I can't." "Then we'll sit here until you can." Henry pulled up a chair. He sat across from her. They drank coffee in silence while the night pressed against the boarded windows. At dawn, Henry drove her to Hartwell Springs. Ruth was already in the courthouse, setting up. Documents arranged, witnesses contacted, all the machinery of the law prepared to defend what was right. The judge was the same woman who had ruled against Margaret 3 weeks earlier. Her name was Janet Morrison. She read the new briefs carefully. She studied the probate documents. She asked questions of both lawyers, sharp questions that suggested she understood what had happened. The original transfer, Judge Morrison said, looking at Susan Helms, was based on the finding that the property had been abandoned, correct? Yes, Your Honor. But the probate records show clear evidence of active ownership and maintenance through 1999. How was this information not available to the court in the original proceeding? Helms opened her mouth, closed it. The records were not provided to the court at that time. The records were available to the court, Ruth said, standing. They're public record, filed in the same courthouse. They were never requested because no one was looking for them. The original proceeding was conducted without proper notice to the legitimate heir. Judge Morrison set down the documents. She looked directly at Margaret. Ms. Finch, do you have any statement you'd like to make? Margaret stood. She had not planned what she would say. She had not written anything down. She simply spoke from what she felt, what she knew, what had been carved into her heart over the past 3 weeks. My mother left this property to me, Margaret said. Not because I deserved it, but because she loved me. She loved me even when I wasn't here to be loved. She protected that building and that shop for 31 years after she died, through a woman who was her best friend. She did it because she believed I would come home someday, that I would understand what she had built, that I would know what to do with it. Margaret paused. She looked at her daughter, sitting in the gallery. Diane was looking away at the wall, refusing to meet her eyes. My daughter forged a document, Margaret continued. She did that because she thought I wouldn't come back. She thought the shop would be forgotten. She was wrong. I came back. And I found something that my mother had left for me. Not just money, not just a building, but a record of a life spent helping other people. A record of kindness. I want to honor that. I want to use that shop the way my mother would have wanted. But I can't do that if I don't own it. And I own it because my mother's will says so. Because Eleanor Walsh kept it safe. Because the law says that abandonment is not the same as love. And my mother never abandoned anything she cared about. She sat down. Ruth squeezed her hand once. No one else moved. Judge Morrison took off her glasses. She rubbed her eyes. Then she picked up her pen and began to write. The property at 247 Main Street, Colton Mills, was never abandoned, she said, speaking slowly, documenting the record. Clear evidence of active ownership and maintenance exists from 1988 through 1999 and beyond. The original transfer of the deed to Diane Finch was made without proper notice to the legitimate heir and is therefore null and void. Title to the property reverts to Margaret Finch, as stated in the will of Helen Macklin filed in this court in 1988. She set down her pen. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The deed is returned to Margaret Finch. The property is hers. Case dismissed. Margaret sat in the courtroom for a long time after everyone else had left. She held the certified copy of the court's decision, and she couldn't quite believe it was real. Ruth came back and sat next to her. You won, Ruth said. I won. Your mother was right about you. You were worth waiting for. The work started the day after the hearing. Henry came to the shop with a truck full of tools and materials. Vera arrived at noon with sandwiches and coffee. A man named Robert Chen, who owned the hardware store and had known Margaret's mother, showed up with a crew and began rewiring the electrical system. A woman named Sarah Oakes, who ran the garden center north of town, came with flowers and began replanting the beds in front of the shop. Word had spread through Colton Mills that the Tailor shop was going to reopen. By the second week, there were more people. A plumber named Thomas Garrett, who had his business gutted by a fire in 1982 and was kept afloat by Margaret's mother's free alterations while he rebuilt. A retired electrician named Paul Huang, who came to help with the wiring. A young couple, Maya and David, who had moved to town 6 months ago and heard the story from Vera and wanted to be a part of something real. And there was another person, a woman named Sophie, maybe 30 years old, who showed up on a Tuesday morning with everything she owned in a backpack. She was thin in the way of people who hadn't been eating regularly. She had no references and no job history. She asked if there was any work available. Margaret recognized herself in Sophie immediately. "There's an apartment upstairs," Margaret said. 2 rooms, a bathroom, a kitchen. It's not fancy, but it's yours if you want it. And there's work. We're reopening the tailor shop. I could use help." Sophie's eyes widened. "I don't know how to sew." "Neither did my mother when she started," Margaret said. "But she learned. So can you." Sophie moved into the apartment that afternoon. Margaret showed her how to wind thread on bobbins. She showed her how to thread a needle. She sat with her at a cutting table and put a piece of cloth in front of her and said, "Let's start with straight lines." By the 3rd week, the shop was ready. The windows had been uncovered. The interior had been cleaned and organized. The bolts of cloth were arranged by color. The tools were hung on pegboards, exactly as they had been when Margaret's mother was alive. Henry had built new shelves in the back room to display the finished pieces, jackets and trousers, dresses and shirts, all the things Margaret's mother had created and preserved. On a Monday morning in April, Margaret unlocked the front door of the tailor shop for the first time in 23 years. She turned the sign from closed to open. She stood in the doorway and looked out at Main Street, at the paint peeling from the old theater, at the boarded windows of buildings that had been left behind, at the world that had moved on but hadn't moved far. Then she walked back inside and took her place at her mother's work table. And she waited for someone to walk through the door. The first customer arrived at 10:30. It was a man Margaret didn't know, maybe 50 years old, with a wedding invitation and a suit that needed to fit properly. He looked embarrassed about needing help. Margaret recognized that embarrassment, the shame of asking for something, the belief that you didn't deserve attention or care. "The shoulders are too tight," she said, not asking, just observing. "And the jacket's too long. We can fix that. It'll take about a week." The man looked grateful. He looked like someone who had been invisible for a long time and was suddenly being seen. Margaret understood that feeling too. She measured the suit carefully. She made notes on a pad her mother had used, the paper still pristine and lined. She wrote the man's name, Dennis Howell, and the date, and the adjustments needed. She didn't ask for a deposit. She didn't ask for payment until the work was done. "Come back a week from today," she said. "It'll be ready." By summer, the tailor shop had a steady stream of customers. People came to have clothes fitted. People came to have broken zippers replaced. People came to learn to sew. Margaret taught a Tuesday night class to anyone interested, free, with materials provided. Old people who remembered her mother. Young people who didn't know anything about tailoring but wanted to learn something real with their hands. Sophie became confident at the cutting table. She learned to read a pattern. She learned to match seams. By August, Margaret was teaching her to cut jacket linings, and Sophie was doing it with precision and care. The photograph of Helen Macklin hung on the wall behind the counter, in the same frame Margaret had found it. Next to it, Margaret mounted a photograph of Eleanor Walsh smiling on her porch. And next to that, she hung a wooden sign with words her mother had written in one of the hidden letters. "The best thing about fixing something is that it stays fixed." On a Friday evening in September, when the light was starting to turn golden and the air had the first hint of autumn, a young man walked through the door. He was maybe 23 years old, with a backpack and worn shoes, and the particular tiredness that comes from having nowhere to sleep. He looked around at the shop, at the neat rows of cloth, at the customers being fitted, at Sophie working at the cutting table. And he said, "Is there any work available?" Margaret smiled. She recognized the question. She recognized the desperation underneath it, the hope and fear all tangled together. "Come on back," she said. "Let's talk." She made him a sandwich, turkey and cheese, tomato and lettuce, the way her mother used to make them. She set it on a plate with a glass of water, and she said, "The apartment upstairs has another room. You can have it if you want to work here. We'll figure out the rest as we go." The young man's name was Marcus. He had been drifting for 2 years. He had no references and no job history. He was grateful and terrified in equal measure. Margaret showed him where he could set his backpack. She showed him the cutting table, and she put her hand on his shoulder and said, "You're safe here." That evening, after Marcus had gone upstairs and Sophie was finishing a seam, after the last customer had left and the light was fading from the street, Margaret stood alone in the tailor shop. She walked to the back room and looked at the compartment where she had found the letters. The brick was back in place, sealed. The compartment would never be opened again. She climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment. Her apartment. She had moved into the space above the shop in June, after selling her apartment in the city. She had brought very little with her, some clothes, some dishes, a few books. She had filled the rest of the space with things from her mother's life. Photographs, letters, the leather journal. The bonds framed together, a record of decades of love expressed in small financial increments. She sat in the dormer window that looked out over Main Street. The evening light caught the panes of glass and turned them golden. Below, she could see the street, the old theater, the closed shops, the hardware store's warm light. She could see Vera's diner where customers were having dinner. She could see Eleanor's house, just barely visible from this angle, the porch light glowing. Margaret held the last letter her mother had written, the one dated 6 months before she died. She had read it dozens of times now, but she held it still, the paper soft from handling. "I loved you every single day," her mother had written. Margaret had understood in the past months that this was not something that needed to be said. This was something that had to be lived. Love wasn't words. It was the oiled hinges Henry had kept shining for 40 years. It was Eleanor paying taxes on a building for a daughter she had never met. It was Vera keeping a photo on her diner wall. It was all of them, collectively, holding space for someone to come home to. She set the letter on the windowsill next to a brass key, a worn ratchet handle, a photograph of Helen Macklin in her youth, standing in the tailor shop with her hands on her hips and joy on her face. She set a small ceramic hen there too, something her mother had collected, something Margaret had found in a box labeled "For Beauty." The street below was quiet. A few people walked past going home. The sun was almost below the horizon. The windows of the buildings across the street were glowing with lamplight and television, with the small, ordinary lights of people living their lives. Margaret sat in the window and watched the light change. She thought about the word home. She had spent 16 years running away from it and 18 years not coming back to it. She had thought home was a place you left. She had not understood that home was something you built, slowly, through small acts of showing up and fixing things and helping people and being present. The best thing about fixing something is that it stays fixed. She had learned that from her mother. She had learned it by discovering that her mother's love, expressed through decades of hidden care, did not fade. It did not break. It held. It endured. It was waiting, patient as brick and mortar, for Margaret to come home and claim it. And now, in the golden evening light, in the apartment above the tailor shop, surrounded by the artifacts of the people who had loved her, Margaret understood that she was finally, completely, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was perfect, not because it was easy, but because it was real, and it was hers. and it was a place where broken things could be fixed and people who were running could stop running and decide to stay. She picked up her mother's letter and held it against her chest. Below her, on Main Street, a light in the Tailor shop window cast a warm glow onto the sidewalk. Someone walking past might have seen that light and known that the shop was open, that someone was there, that help was available. Someone running with nothing in their pockets might have seen that light and known there was a door they could walk through, a sandwich that would be made without questions, a place where they could stop and breathe and become something other than scared. That was the inheritance. That was what Margaret's mother had left her. Not the money, not the building, not the records and the letters and the bonds. Those were just the evidence. The real inheritance was the knowledge that kindness works, that helping matters, that the best way to love someone is to show up and fix what's broken and then to let them do it for someone else, and then to watch the world get a little bit better because somebody decided that it was worth the trouble. Margaret sat in the window as the light faded from the street. Below her, the shop settled into evening. The thread spools gleamed on their shelves. The bolts of cloth held the last of the daylight. The work table where her mother had spent her life was waiting for tomorrow, for another customer, for another person who would walk through the door and be transformed into who they really were meant to be. Margaret folded the letter carefully and set it back on the windowsill. She sat in the gathering dark and listened to the house settle around her. Somewhere upstairs, Sophie was reading in her room. Somewhere upstairs, Marcus was sleeping his first safe sleep in 2 years. And down on Main Street, in a diner and a hardware store and a quiet house with green shutters, people were living the kind lives that Margaret's mother had made possible. One seam at a time, one small kindness at a time, one day at a time. Home isn't where you end up. It's where you stop running and decide to fix what's broken.